Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of Roaring Back the Years. Today's show will be discussing about qualifying formats, looking at the different ones, so like the 60-minute sessions, the single lap shootouts, the knockout formats, you name them all. We'll be going through the history of them, how that has impacted the likes of Formula 1 and so forth, and we'll be discussing about the drawbacks that they had to having these different kind of formats in place. So, the first question is, how was the grid decided at first? Well, before Formula 1 began in 1950, apparently they used to decide the grid by giving drivers random numbers that determine the grid for the race. So they didn't have like a qualifying session. They just used to give a driver or allow the driver to pick a number out of a ballot or whatever you want to call it. Not a ballot, but like what they use for like the FA Cup draw or a League Cup draw or whatever. Pick out a number, pull it out, and whatever number is on there, they start the race on that position. So regardless of whether the fact that you're in a fast car or in a slow car, it doesn't matter. You start in that position anyway. But back in those days in Formula 1, wherever you are or wherever you were on the grid wasn't as important as it is now. So by the time we got to 1950, when F1 began, they had 2 1-hour sessions for qualifying. The first session being on the Friday afternoon, and the second one being on the Saturday afternoon. Now, the problem with that was if the Saturday session was wet or the conditions on the Saturday were worse than what they were on the Friday, then the second session was meaningless because the drivers could not improve on their times from the day before. So it was just a matter of either just staying in the garage and protect your cars, or go out and see what it's like in the wets in case the race on Sunday happens to be wet, and gather as much data as possible. So they did 2 1-hour sessions, one on the Friday and one on the Saturday, from 1950 to 1995. And along with those sessions, in the 80s, particularly 1989 to 1991, when there were more than 30 cars entering an event, they had to use what's called a pre-qualifying session to narrow down the number of entries for the race week, for the remainder of the race weekend. So if we had 31, which we did at times, I particularly think in 1988 we had 31 cars, the top 13 constructors from the previous season, for the first half of the current season, would automatically go through to the qualifying session on the Saturday. The rest have to pre-qualify to get into qualifying. So the remainder 5 cars, so the 26, automatically go through to qualifying, the other 5 having to pre-qualify, and the slowest of them would be out for the rest of the weekend. Narrowing it down to 30 cars for the qualifying session, for the 2-hour, 1-hour sessions. So yeah, for the 2 1-hour sessions, I should say. And in 1989, when the grid had expanded to 39, there were 13 cars having to pre-qualify. And going back to what I was saying about who determines getting through to qualifying automatically, for the first half of the season, the top 13 constructors from the previous season, and in the second half of the season, the current top 13 constructors automatically go through to qualifying. So let's say, for example, let's just use current teams, for instance, like Mercedes or Ferrari and Red Bull. They're not going to be having to pre-qualify because they're going to be too quick for those in that same session with them. And it's the same for like the second half of the season when they're at the top of the table in like the championship or whatever. So that's just your example there, hypothetically anyway. By the time we got to 1992, when the field had been narrowed down to 30 cars for the championship, pre-qualifying was redundant. So moving away from the 2-hour, 1-hour sessions and the pre-qualifying, by the time we got to 1996, they had got rid of the Friday qualifying and just had a 1 hour session on the Saturday to determine the grid for the race. And along with that was being introduced at the time was what's called the 107% rule, which some of you will know how it works. But for those who don't, the 107% rule is a time that a driver must set in order to get into the race. So if a driver sets a lap time of 1 minute 40.000, the 107% time would be 1 minute 47.000. So that's the time that drivers racing in inferior cars, if you want a description of that, that's the time they have to be in the race in order to get into the race. So they're like not too slow, like the Lolas were in their only race with the MasterCard sponsorship and so in 1997 in Australia. Or even 40. I mean, 40 fell foul of it in 96 when this 107% rule was introduced. So this 1 hour 60-minute session was there from 1996 to 2002. Now the drawbacks to this was drivers waiting for the best conditions to go out and set their fastest time. So if, let's say, the session started being dry and it got wet later on and drivers had no chance of setting a better time, then the session's effectively over. But the good side to it is if the session starts damp or wet and gets dry later on, then that gets far more interesting. Like we saw in, I think it was at the Nürburgring in 1999, where we had the likes of Frentzen, Irvine, Hakkinen and Coulthard battling out for pole position as the track was drying out. And the drivers also had a maximum of 12 laps, including in-laps and out-laps, to set the best time possible to be on pole position. When we got to 2003, qualifying had changed from what was the 1 60-minute session to a single lap shootout. Now they did this in two parts actually. In 2003 they had a Friday qualifying session to determine the order of which the cars would go out for the Saturday session that would determine the grid for the race. So the slowest car in the Friday one would go out first in the Saturday one, and the fastest on the Friday would go out last on the Saturday. And the good thing about that is you see the slower cars go out first, followed by the faster ones at the end. Mostly, invariably anyway. Mostly invariably anyway, in case you see like drivers who have had an off in the Friday session or something. And what they used to determine the Friday order was the championship order. A bit like what they do in Formula E. So they have like the driver at the top of the championship go out first, and then the driver lowest in the championship competing that weekend going out last. And then they do the reverse of the classification of the Friday for the Saturday qualifying session for the race. 2004, both sessions were then moved to the Saturday. So the first session being in the morning, and then the second one in the afternoon. And by the time we got to 2005, they would have the two sessions being added together. But how it worked was the first session for the first... This was something that was happening for the first 6 races, by the way, before they changed back to a single one. But this is what they call aggregate qualifying, where the first session would be without race fuel levels, where drivers would set their flying lap on how much fuel they want, or how little fuel they want, to get the best time possible. And the second session on the Sunday morning would be on race fuel levels. So the two times were added together to determine the grid for the race. But after the Monaco Grand Prix in Monte Carlo, that aggregate qualifying system was ditched because it took some of the unpredictability away when it came to qualifying, really. So reverting back to just a single one-lap shootout for the remainder of 2005. 2006 saw what is now the current knockout format system, where to begin with in 2006, when we had 22 cars, the slowest 6 would go out at the end of the first 15-minute session. The second 6 go out at the end of the second 15-minute session, leaving the top 10 to battle out for pole position in a 20-minute Q3 part. But for Q3, back when we had refueling, the drivers would go into Q3 on the amount of fuel that they would start the race on. So it's important for them to make sure they don't burn out too much fuel too soon. Which sometimes you see drivers sacrifice their qualifying time to give themselves the best strategy possible for the race. And others who just wanted to go for pole position to get the best places on the grid and to help them with their strategy as well. Depending on what car you were driving in, I suppose, at the time on that weekend. When refueling was banned for 2010, that changed, obviously. And when we had 24 cars as well, the slowest 7 would go at the end of Q1, the slowest 7 would go at the end of Q2, and the top 10 would go through to a 10-minute Q3 session. And those who make it into Q3 would have to start the race on the same set of tyres as they'd set their Q3 time. Whereas nowadays they would have to start the race on the same tyres as they set their Q2 time, their fastest Q2 time, to get into Q3. So there was been slight changes in terms of how long each session was, but the thing was, the reason why they changed it from what was... to begin with the knockout format, it was obviously 15 minutes, and then 20 minutes. To then 15, 15, 15, then 20, 15, then 10. And then for 2014, they changed it from 18, to 18, 15, and 12. So they basically took 2 minutes away from the Q1 session to add to the Q3 one to help provide more action for the crowd, particularly for those who are going for pole position, especially on longer tracks like Spa, Singapore, and so and so. 2016 saw a temporary change where this 90-second knockout format, where after, I think it was something like 7 minutes or something, after the first 7 minutes of Q1 or something, that would begin ticking down the 90-second timer, where whoever's in that danger zone, if you want to call it, at the end of that 90 seconds, regardless of whether they're on the flying lap or not, that driver would be eliminated. This was in for the first 2 races of 2016 in Australia and Bahrain, and it was a farce. It just didn't work. It took a lot of the unpredictability away. It took a lot of the entertainment away, and the fans didn't like it, the teams didn't like it, the drivers didn't like it, and so the FIA had decided to revert back to its normal knockout format, where they have a set of drivers go out at the end of Q1 and Q2 and leaving the top 10 back out for pole position in Q3. Now, there's obviously been minor alterations, like minor changes to how qualifying would work. Now, if a qualifying session is red flagged because of an incident out on circuit or a driver stopped out on circuit, the time would stop so that it doesn't take any away time from when drivers need to go out and do a faster lap, unlike they do in practice when they just allow the time to tick down because they've got other like support races going on in like F2 or F3. And talking of which of F2, that takes me on to this format that they do for Monaco for each year, where they would split the qualifying session. They have like a 30-minute session in F2, but they split it into 2 parts where they have the odd-numbered drivers go out in the first session and the even-numbered drivers going out in the second one. But the drawbacks to that was the second set could end up having the better track conditions. But they do that in Monaco because of the number of cars involved, and the fact that it's so easy to get held up by another driver on the streets of Monte Carlo than it is on another racetrack. Whereas like, on every other circuit in F2, or even in F3, because they have a similar qualifying format to F2, where drivers would be able to. They have like a 30-minute session to have the best time, to get the best time possible for the race. Really, they don't have like a Q1 or a Q2 or a Q3 like they do in Formula One, because otherwise that'll just take too much of the time when they've got other races going on. Now the drawbacks as well for F3, actually, what we had at Monza last year, where some drivers were on flying laps, but as they were about to complete them, there was like a whole gaggle of cars, sort of not. I wouldn't want to say camping, because they weren't camping. They were just crawling round the Parabolica, preparing for their flying laps. And because they had to back out of it, and all of this got very messy, the FIA, the stewards had to intervene and red flag the session and not restart it because it was getting too dangerous. So this is a thing where you don't want to have too many cars involved in events, but you don't want to have too little, because the fans want to see a decent number of cars involved to be fighting it out for victory. So, to summarise, before Formula 1 began, the drivers had to draw random numbers to determine the grid. For the first 46 years of Formula 1, they did 2 one-hour sessions, one on the Friday, one on the Saturday. They had pre-qualifying as well to help narrow down the number of runners for the remainder of the weekend in the 80s and the early 90s as well. And in 96 they reduced the 2 one-hour sessions to just one, along with the 107% rule that was introduced. And that was and to add as well with the 107% rule, that was brought back in 2011. So I like to say the word encourage, to encourage teams to set faster times in Q1 in order to earn their place in the grid on Sunday. So it wasn't just a matter of fact that they wanted the certain numbers in the race, they wanted cars that were not too slow to be in the race. And rightly so. When we got to 2003, they got rid of the 1 60-minute session to a single lap shootout, where drivers would go out one by one to set the best time possible to determine the grid for the race. And if a driver failed to complete their lap, they would start the race from the back of the grid. When we got to 2006, there was the knockout format that we have today, where they split it into 3 parts. Certain number of drivers, well, depending on how many cars are on the grid, of course, a set of cars would be knocked out at the end of Q1. Another set of cars would be knocked out at the end of Q2, leaving the top 10 to battle out for pole position. And there was also the 90-second knockout format as well, where a driver one by one would be eliminated with this 90-minute session. So the 90-second knockout system to determine the grid for the race, which was only in for 2 races before the FIA ditched it. Now, another thing I want to add, actually, before I draw this podcast to a close, is in IndyCar, when they do the Indy 500, they decide the grid through an average speed of 10 miles. So it's not the lap times that they use to determine the grid for the Indy 500. It's actually the average speed, which is interesting, actually. I think that's actually a better solution, because the lap times are going to be very, very close, considering they're racing on an oval. And looking at the average speed, it looks more like it separates the grid a little bit more to determine who starts where on the grid. So average speed is very important in Indy anyway. That was just something to add to what I've already discussed. So I'll bring this podcast to a close. Thank you for listening to this episode discussing about qualifying formats. If you do have any questions for the final episode, which will be on racetrack configurations, so we'll be looking at particular ones like Imola, particularly like the Tamburello corner that was changed to a chicane, and also the entry to Tosa that was also changed to a chicane. We'll be looking at other ones as well, in terms of what they had and why they changed certain parts of the track to make racing better and safer that way. So if you do have any questions for that, then do please tweet in at Downforce Radio, or you can tweet to me at Tom Cairns 95, and I'll share them for the next show. So that will be the final episode of Roaring Back the Years. If you haven't listened to any of the other shows, do please listen to them on Spreaker. You can go to the Downforce Radio account on Spreaker and listen to those podcasts there. So thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Roaring Back the Years, Episode 9, Qualifying Formats. Presented by Racing History Editor Tom Cairns. Produced by Florian Schmeis. This has been a high-speed Autobahn production for Downforce Radio, the nation's motorsport station. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again on Roaring Back the Years.